Basically, I think there's two major ways to make a splash in entertainment.
With topics like this and whatever, I'm so like, I don't care that I feel like I need...
Conservatives have this idea, like, I think conservatives by and large do subscribe to the idea that, like,
if there's a single trans person that goes and tries to kill lawmakers or kill Republicans and they say that it was in part because of what they saw on Vosh's channel, then like...
When that first happened, I remember thinking, if we don't draw the line here, where the f do we draw the line?
So I have a lot of different topics all over the place. Maybe where we should start is your return to streaming. So some people in the chat seem to think that this is your return to streaming. They may have missed the last VOD. Do you want to talk about that hiatus and coming back to streaming a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't like a planned hiatus or anything like that. It wasn't like, guys, I'm quitting streaming for a little while or whatever. I just, I was wrapping up the semester. I had fallen a little bit behind on my schoolwork. I'm determined to, finish my degree with all A's. So I had to focus on that for a little bit, but now the semester's done and it's business as usual. So I'll be starting again Monday.
And coming back to streaming, what are some of your plans? Like, what are some things you want to do now that you didn't do before?
There are a lot of people I want to talk to that I didn't really, I just didn't have the time or energy to reach out to. I'm reaching out to now. And I also want to really start doing IRL streaming. I want to, California is a beautiful place. There's a lot of cool things to do around here. Me and IRI go out to lunch, and every time we do it, he tells me I should have streamed it. Maybe he's right, and he's probably right. I don't know. I'd like to meet more people in the area and hang out. And yeah, I'm ready to branch out. I'm ready to reach out. And, we're in kind of a bubble in this space, in this Twitch space, and I'm ready to leave it behind and carve my own path a little more. I think I've done pretty well to do that up until this point, but yeah, I'm ready to sort of carve out my own space and maybe a new umbrella for other streamers to rise up under. I'm inspired by streamers that have done that, created an industrial complex under them or something, but it's gonna take a lot of work. But I'm excited.
Yeah. Some advice that people give us all the time, and it is good advice, like viewers and streamers alike both know that this is the case, is like, you should collab more, you should interact with more streamers. But what they might not know about are like what the barriers are to doing that. Why is it that more streamers don't do a ton of collabs or don't do a lot of these interviews and that kind of stuff?
I'm not sure I have the answer to that, because I'm just as bad as probably the rest of them. Maybe I'm sort of an emblem of the problem. Maybe I exemplify the problem, which is that streamers, we get comfortable, right? We fall into a groove. Our job gets to be pretty easy, and it's it's kind of a min-maxing effort to production. A lot of us sort of live and work and sleep at our desks. And so reaching out is kind of hard. And even if you do reach out, people aren't super willing to leave their bubble or leave their routine or something like that. I think that probably has a lot to do with it. I don't know if that's so much a complication or a difficulty, but that just seems to be that the tendency of people who stream for a living just don't seem super willing. I feel like there's probably some crossover between... I can start here. So once upon a time, I was really rebellious about the workplace, especially for people who did a lot of digital, sort of labor. Sort of intellectual labor, technical writing, that sort of thing. And I always used to say, like, is the workplace obsolete? Is going into work, getting dressed, putting on a suit and going into work, is that an obsolete thing now in the age of the internet when we can do pretty much everything remotely? And I guess we saw that put to the test during COVID. But I think people who end up becoming streamers are people that fall into the same line of thinking, where we don't really see a lot of, we feel like we can do everything pretty remotely. But I'm not sure that that's true anymore. And I'm really starting to see the value in meeting up in person and doing real things. I think I'm bored. I think COVID has bored me. There's been such a deluge of content of people in their living rooms or in their bedrooms. I'm sick of fucking seeing everybody's living rooms. I'm sick of seeing everybody's bedrooms. I'm ready to get back out there,
Yeah. Do you think that there's anything to be said about fixing that at the house, like having multiple different streaming setups that you cycle between, or is it always like an outside thing?
I mean, I guess you could do that at the house, but how many of those can you have? Like 2 or 3? I mean, you'd have to buy a camera for each one, or you'd have to like pick the camera up and move it around, adjust the focus if that's your candy. Yeah, I don't know. You could.
Yeah. Like for your setup, it would be more difficult because you have like a whole ass camera. But I think that like, at least for me, you could buy like a $20 tripod and you could just have one tripod at the house. And then you can take pictures to remember how the camera was set up. And I don't think it's like a lot of steps, but like you said, there's this habits, the streaming groove, that kind of thing that stops people from doing it. But you could definitely have like a bed stream, a kitchen table stream, and a you're at your desk stream, and you could create these different settings at the house. Maybe also a kitchen stream for a lot of people. Like I think there's a lot you could do just in the house if you're willing to think about it. And that's why, like, I don't know, it feels like you could also solve this problem of different settings within the house as well. Maybe more than people think about.
Yeah, but that doesn't help you collab with other people.
No, for sure not.
Yeah.
That just gets to your point about like, I want to see more than just like your bedroom stream. Like, I think that you can definitely check that box off pretty easily within your own house, but
Fair enough.
Don't.
I guess let me be more precise. I'm sick of seeing the inside of people's homes in production. I went to the movie theater yesterday, and like, before the movies, now they have these sorts of things where you've got these sort of like micro personalities introducing the movie, talking about the movie. They'll do interviews with the director or something, or producer or something like that. And the one that was presented before this movie, it was a fucking Zoom call, or maybe a Discord call or something. And it was the same thing. It was like somebody had a streaming setup in front of a producer in front of their, like, you know what I mean? Like at their desk at home. And I'm like, man, I'm pining. I'm longing for the days where people used to sit down on one of those little foldy chairs in front of just, whatever. Wherever it was, I don't care. Just sick of seeing the insides of people's homes.
Yeah, and a little bits in chat mentions green screens as well. A bit more technically challenging to execute well, but that's another thing that could open up a lot of doors for being in different locations, or having a more visually interesting stream for sure. But tougher to execute, I gotta say. Like, you have to be good at lighting to do green screen well, I feel like. And if you don't get the lighting right, the green screen won't look good. Have you tried anything with green screens?
Okay, I personally think that green screens are hokey. It's very rare. Like, Rhizome is 1 out of 1 people that I think has a green screen setup that doesn't look cheesy and corny and like a cheap 90s special effect.
Yeah, he works really hard on that, and I think it shows. His setup is amazing, technically speaking, for sure.
Yeah, and he's like an industry, that's basically what he studied for, what he trained for, and he took like 2 months to put it together.
Yeah, and I don't know, I think it should be apparent to people how much work went into Rhizome's stream in particular, but in case they don't know, like, lighting aside, setting up that virtual background and getting the perspective right and everything else, it's tougher than I think a lot of people give us credit for to do that right. And like you said, I can't think of anybody else besides like huge streamers that do that well off of the top of my head. I know people that do funny things with it, but they would still be in the realm of like hokey, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's the case as well.
Yeah. When you took this hiatus, were you worried very much about like the drop off that would happen to the channel, or like not so much because you knew you had to take time off for finals and stuff?
It's always a worry with streaming, right? Like, even if you have to take a single day off, you worry about, people getting the idea that you're not coming back or something like that, or finding something else to do. Yeah, sure.
And I know that we've talked about
it's inevitable. To be clear, it's inevitable. It's going to happen. I'm going to come back, and there are going to be less people than there were before, but sure, yeah, that's just a reality.
It's something that you're kind of always fighting against. Is this kind of I think you've worded it as like the decay, maybe, or how
atrophy.
Did you atrophy? There we go.
Well, atrophy is not necessarily dependent on taking time off. Atrophy, I think, just refers to the fact that I think most people that are attempting to be personalities or attempting a career in media, if you do not work to grow, you can rely on a trend of atrophy. Like, you're going to see degrowth, you're going to see downsizing in whatever it is in your career and entertainment if you're not actively working and like working your ass off to stay relevant and to find the next biggest thing.
Yeah. And like, for you, I know that we've talked a lot in private about this, at least, like, what do you feel like is the key to fighting off atrophy or to fighting off degrowth? Like, what are the variables there that you see that you need to focus on?
You have to work, you have to network, you have to innovate, you have to, constantly be working to find some way to either refine your brand or introduce it to new people. You have to market. You have to collaborate.
Mhm. But a lot of us aren't doing that, right?
Sure. Yeah. I guess by definition. Yeah.
Mm.
Or if they are doing it, they're not doing it well enough. I mean, entertainment is just seems to be an incredibly competitive space to the to the extent that like such a small proportion of people who ever attempt it can ever find permanence or carve out a career or make a living doing it. Yeah.
What do you say to the people? Because there's at least a couple of them in chat right now talking about the need for personality to fight back on that, or the need for original content to fight back on that. Like, are they right? Are they wrong? Are they missing a bit of the picture there with that kind of advice, or what?
I think it's all true. I think there's oh man, I've just thought about this for such a long time. And yeah, I think there's a hint of that in everything. Of course, you need to have personality. Or I shouldn't say you need to have, because some people, like Ben Stein was kind of a big celebrity, and he's kind of known for being like chewing cardboard to listen to. I'm Ben Stein, Bueller, that guy. But he ended up developing a personality and telling a lot of jokes and stuff. And he was a writer, and so he probably wrote a bunch of his own jokes and shit. That's work that he put in. Novelty is a big part of it, right? Basically, I think there's two major ways to make a splash in entertainment. One is to be the best, like to be the best person to offer the best form of a given type of content. So one example would be, I think Destiny in this sphere, the way that he does politics, the way that he does like real world events, I think he does it like better than anybody else for the most part because of the work that he puts in. I'm really important. Does electoral politics on the platform, like U.S. Congress stuff, better than anybody else. And the alternative to that is doing something novel. You kind of have to you have to decide, am I going to do this better than anybody else? Or am I going to do something that nobody else is doing? And like, I kind of have to do that well. So I think like Mr. Girl sort of filled that niche where he was doing something that nobody else was doing. You saw the comments that he was getting about it. He's refreshingly honest. He had like a brand that was unique. My perception is that if you're not like that, those are grooves that you can't stay in for too long. It really depends. I think I'm Really Important is a really good example of somebody who in this line of work and in entertainment, he's basically like earned permanence, and he has to worry maybe less than people offering some other type of work, because politics is kind of a gift in that it's a little bit dry, but it's never going to end, and it's always going to be important to people. It's always going to be relevant. He's always going to have an audience, and there's always going to be new fresh content that's important that people have to pay attention to. Whereas like somebody like I don't know, can we think of a gimmick like Code Miko or something like that? That's kind of a gimmick, and people kind of get bored of gimmicks after a while. I'm not sure exactly what her career looks like, but that's like a thing that I would be worried about if I were like a Code Miko or a Tom Green or something like that, right? Somebody who's like totally wild and exuberant and whoa, he just does the wrong thing in every situation. It's like, okay, people are going to get bored of that. It's a gimmick. You can't really live on that forever.
Yeah. I had noted, and maybe this is looking too deep into it, that when you're talking about Mr. Girl having this unique thing, you said had. Do you feel like something has changed since the beginning of stream, or he's become something that's more mainstream, or like what is the thought process there on the past tense?
No, I didn't mean anything serious, but I think that's I didn't mean to I think you might be reading into that a bit.
Okay. What, like, beyond the honesty and stuff, with his content itself, do you feel like Mr. Girl is doing anything interesting in terms of like the way his streams are formatted or what he's covering or stuff like that as well?
I don't catch a whole lot of his content, but just like the delivery and the framing, everything's always kind of dark and meant to be kind of disturbing and weird and shit like that. I think he does that better than basically everybody else I've seen that's tried something similar. I think a lot of people try that, but I think he's also, legitimately kind of weird, and that really helps him. So
going back and going on hiatus again, what would you do differently, like about that transition into going on hiatus? Because I know that at least my understanding is the only place you had mentioned to people about the hiatus or about what you're doing was on Discord. Are there some things you would have changed there to make it more clear to people what it is that you were doing or your intentions there?
Yeah, I guess I wish I would have figured it out before I ended my previous stream. and mention something there, I suppose. But there was a little bit, like sometimes when we do things, we wonder how this is going to work out, and things kind of work out like experiments. Where I was like, I wonder if this is going to bring people to the Discord to figure out where the hell I'm at.
Mm.
I don't really have the time or energy to do a stream right now. Where the hell am I going, or where have I gone stream or something? But I wonder if doing that, and it had that effect. A couple people joined the Discord, probably wondering where the hell is he. He's not at his stream's not live at his usual time and place. So I don't know.
Mm. Okay. One thing that we talk about a lot to kind of close out this like streaming related segment is about what are the variables to streaming success? Like, what is it that makes people have the staying power or build that audience that will keep coming back? Like, if you were to summarize your findings there, or like the notes that you've taken on various streamers, like, do you have anything you could share with people about that, or bounce it off of the chat a little bit?
Man, I never know. And I've been asking that recently because there are some streamers, I'll try to watch them and I don't really get it. Maybe it's a matter of I'm just not understanding what I'm seeing, or I'm just not watching long enough to see the high points, to see how high the high points can get. But there are some like huge streamers, like XQC is not a mystery to me. XQC makes perfect sense to me, right? Like I feel like I'm repeating myself. I feel like I've said this a lot before. You watch that guy for 10 seconds and you're like, okay, this person is unlike, 99%. I don't think I've ever seen a person like this, where XQC has staying power because he just stays dynamic and you never know what you're going to get, and stays kind of random as long as you watch him. It doesn't matter. Whereas some people are kind of dry and like, I think, so I've never watched this person steadily, but like Mitch Jones is an example of someone who can stay gone for years and come back and still have like 5-figure viewership. Like they just know to find him if he goes live. And I don't even know if he does an announcement or something. And I've watched him a little bit and I'm just like, I don't understand what's being given here that summons this kind of audience, nor what keeps him so impervious to atrophy. And yeah, like it's always a mystery to me. But I would say your best probable bets, if you ever find yourself in a place where you gain like a large enough audience or whatever that can carry you forward, is that you have to keep improving, you have to grow, your content has to like change a little bit but not too quickly, because that can turn people off or whatever. I think in the streaming space you have to be somebody that people are excited to sort of like spend their lives with and go on a journey together, that sort of thing.
And in that way, would parasociality be like an important dimension to that success? Like people need to feel like they're friends with you or they relate to you on some kind of like personal level?
I'm sure that helps, but there's all sorts of ethical quandaries there, I suppose. But I'm sure that helps a lot. Yeah.
Like, where do you feel like that line is? Like, what should you not be doing? What should you be doing in terms of feeding into the parasociality?
I guess one thing I've always said is I've just always told my audience we're not friends. I don't know about that, because for two reasons. Number one, like the people that are like really die hard and that have, been really close in my Discord and stuff like that, it's impossible to avoid. Even from my angle, you know what I mean? Even from my end, it's impossible to avoid getting to know people, getting to know the people that you're spending so much time with. At some point I start spending more time with people than I spend with my own wife, if they're showing up to every stream and interacting and stuff like that, depending on how much I stream. It's impossible to avoid getting to know each other in that way, getting to know about our lives. A little bit trickles through, they tell you a little bit about their lives. You are, offering your life to these people. It's just a natural consequence, and you grow to like each other, and there's no way around it. I think like you develop friendships. Even it's been the case for me, you know what I mean? Like I certainly have developed like some close relationships with people in my in my audience and stuff, even trying my absolute hardest not to. It's inevitable. So I think I'm at a point where I'm gonna stop trying to avoid it so hard, and stick to the rhetoric of like, I'm not gonna help you move. That's really what it comes down to. I'm not going to help you move. If you break down on the freeway and you're like 3 hours away, I'm probably not going to come get you. Something like that. Don't count on me for like life stuff. We're not friends to that extent. But we can be friends in that we're like two people on the planet that enjoy details about each other's lives and each other's company and stuff.
Yeah. And I wonder if that's the case, how much of a disclaimer needs to happen there. Like, I don't know how many chatters are expecting that, like, you would help them with some life issue or something like that. I feel like chatters probably understand the dynamic to some extent, whether subconsciously or not, you know, and I think that's part of what they would understand from it, right? Unless you've like run into something different.
Well, I've certainly witnessed other things happen. Have you ever heard of like Soda Poppin' and the creature?
No, what happened there?
Like Soda Poppin' had some kid show up at his house and like stayed with him for a night or two because like NMP or Nick or whoever his roommate was. I mean, I briefly saw YouTube about this. It was basically like, the kid's harmless. The kid just like stayed there and like did drugs the whole time and like left a bunch of drugs there, and was just like kind of creepy and like kind of weird, and eventually got kicked out. And it was like a whole ordeal. And then the kid like followed Soda Pop into another IRL stream with a bunch of friends. It was kind of gnarly. Yeah, I don't know.
And do you think some disclaimer on the stream would have like stopped that from happening, or is that an inevitability with what we do?
So I think it's a matter of, I think the average person, okay, the average person with like average emotional intelligence or even less than average emotional intelligence is going to know not to like ask me to pick them up from the airport if they know I live nearby. But this is a numbers game. And if you've got hundreds or thousands of eyes on you, I think the odds are just in favor of there's going to be somebody whose EQ is just so low that they don't know that that's not a cool thing to do. And that's what you have to look out for. But I guess at that point, you can't feel bad about telling somebody no if it's going to be one out of every however many people.
Yeah. And I think when they hear the disclaimers, that maybe bounces off the brains of the people that it's meant for. So I don't know how helpful it would be necessarily, or like
right
how many people that filter would catch necessarily. But so there's been a lot going on in the news, a lot going on in the streaming drama space. How much have you caught up with on the Vosh stuff?
I guess I don't think I have like a working encyclopedia of knowledge on the Vosh stuff. You would have to bounce something off me and I could tell you if it was something that I was aware of. But I've been watching a fair bit of Destiny. Like as I've been studying and doing homework, I usually have him on in the background or other streamers and stuff. I've still been around in the Twitch space. That's why I haven't really called it a hiatus. I've had to take time off streaming because I can't like do something actively. I can't like focus on streaming. Streaming is not a thing where I can do my homework and like have the camera on and people are going to be interested. That's not a thing I would want to deliver to an audience anyway. But I've been kind of around. So if you've got something you want to bounce off me, maybe I'll have some insight on it.
Well, I guess I should start with: are you aware that there's a trans genocide happening right now in the United States?
I understand his point, but I think it's absurd. I understand his idea where it's like, well, of course, like it's not happening full-fledged, but this is the obvious lead up to it. This is how it starts. That's his argument, right? And if ever you were to bring this to him and tell him like, bro, come on, they're not rounding up transgender people, he would say, look at the legislation. Look at what happened under Trump, and look, it's still going on. Even under Biden, we're seeing this happen in Florida. Like it's the constant dehumanizing. It's been happening for years and getting worse now. Like that would be his argument. And to be honest, like I feel like the most you can say about that is that it's absurd and that he's taking a leap. And he, I think, he's like a Mont and Bailey expert as well. And I feel like he when he just says like, I just want to make sure that when they come for them that they're armed and ready and that they have the right to defend themselves, is like that's like an inch away from being saying too much. Depending, it might be saying too much. It really depends on what actions people take coming out of this. And at that point he's going to have to learn and like own like, okay, maybe I went a little too far there. Hopefully he does, but I don't think he seems like that type of person. If you've seen his response to the whole submit to the mob situation.
Yeah, although I wonder if a trans person goes out and makes an assassination attempt on like a Republican lawmaker, and they had it came out either through a manifesto or something else that they were like a big Vosh fan, and it was some of the Vosh rhetoric that led them to do that. I wonder what impact that would have on him, though.
Yeah, I mean, like, okay. I'm consulting my crystal ball, and my crystal ball says that you say like, I'm not responsible for the yada yada. Yeah, I don't know. I think he would start to own the whole like stochastic terrorism thing isn't really real, but that would open the door for a lot of other things. Yeah, I don't know. Or I only ever advocated for self-defense, not whatever. I could see that coming, I suppose.
Yeah, that he was careful enough with his rhetoric, and this person doesn't reflect what he was asking people, and he was very explicit and all that.
Right.
Like this fine line that he's walking between like, yeah, you should arm yourselves and you should be ready for this, and we are in the beginning stages, versus like not having people take that a step too far and going in the direction of harming people. Like, from what you've seen of it, do you feel like at any point he is dipping into the negative zone of like encouraging acts against lawmakers or preemptive violence, or not really?
I think it's a thing to be concerned about. I can't give a hard yes or no to that, but I personally think that I think he's taking a step too far in his analysis. I think he's making an analytical leap, of course, and saying something that's, a little bit beyond where we are in reality. And he's being dogmatic about it, which is, my least favorite thing in the world. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about those leaps, because I think like maybe one of the first huge ones is kind of accepting defeat already in 2024 when presidential elections, like I think this is something IRI repeats a lot. It could be down to like the FBI releases a brief right in the middle of it, or you have one single scandal come out about you that flips the entire way the election was going to go. Like I feel like that's a really good place to start with, like your kind of your guessing way too quickly about what's going to happen. Like calling a presidential election in advance seems to be like an obvious example of that. Do you think so as well, or not really?
I agree with IRI. I mean, we saw that in 2016 with, Comey and releasing the report on Hillary or just announcing that they were investigating Hillary over the emails thing. And personally, on a personal level, the reason I Bernie or busted in 2016 is because of the emails. But I'm, a little more personally connected to that world, I guess, and probably meant a lot more to me than it should to most people, maybe, or maybe not. I don't know. I maintain that the emails were a much bigger deal than Democrats would make it out to be in the years coming. But
And even with hindsight, do you feel like that wasn't handled properly, or she didn't get enough trouble for that, or what?
I personally think she didn't get in it. Well, she lost the election. However you want to view this in like a utility way or something, maybe you could say that was her punishment, was not getting to be president or something like that. But yeah, probably. I don't know. Maybe the FBI should have called an investigation later or something, or Comey should have been a little less vocal about it. From the jump. Yeah, maybe.
Do you feel like releasing that memo towards the end of the election was a fair thing for Comey to have done, or do you disagree with that in particular, even if the investigation was a correct action?
It's hard for me to say that it wasn't a fair thing, because maybe we shouldn't be giving people preferential treatment based on how their presidential campaign is going in terms of like investigating them for basically subverting national security laws. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe, you know what? Maybe, yeah, I think when I think about it, maybe it's not on Comey. Maybe it is on Hillary. Shouldn't have fucking broken the rules, idiot. I guess. But
Yeah.
even examining that from the other side, 2016 was surprising in that nobody saw Trump coming, and everybody thought that Trump didn't have a chance, especially, Jon Stewart. I remember Jon Stewart is quoted as saying, like, as soon as I heard him say the stuff about Mexico not sending their best, I knew he was done and that he didn't have a chance. And lo and behold, look what happened. And I think a lot of people felt that way. And when they heard some of like the more, what's considered racist rhetoric from Trump, and I think it was pretty racist, that was it. Like a lot of people wrote Trump off and said, this guy, they were using a conventional lens to view politics through that was, more conventional in the eyes of a 2008 election or 2004 election or something like that. But, a lot of people, I think, failed to consider that we're in the age of Facebook, and accessibility for like the common person is different than what gets to be aired or what pundits say on TV, that may have less of an influence on how people vote. And so we ended up with President Trump kind of under everybody's noses. Yeah. I don't think anybody was calling that Trump would win 2016 early, right?
No, the media narrative seemed to be the exact opposite, that it was a shoo-in for Clinton. Now, you may know more about this than I do, but one counter argument to the Comey thing was that the FBI usually doesn't comment on ongoing investigations, and that it was outside of the norm for them to even say that they're investigating her. Like, is that true? Is that off? Like,
so I wouldn't know. I'm not I'm not privy to FBI protocol, and that may be true. Maybe that's been said before by other people who work at FBI. I can't, I'm not the authority on like how the FBI conducts business, but I could believe that, and it certainly seems to be the way that, there's a balance to strike there. On the one hand, I could see why they would announce an investigation, because the whole point when you're investigating public officials is to like keep your public officials and your public leaders accountable. And the whole reason that you'd want to do that just on a societal level is just to show the citizenry that like your law enforcement institutions are holding public officials accountable, and so that that can like reinvigorate faith in your institutions. So I wouldn't say that there's no reason intuitively that the FBI would ever announce that they're investigating like somebody running for president. But I could believe it too if somebody just said that's not protocol and here are all the reasons why we normally don't do that. Just so that, people can't clean up their tracks and we can continue to investigate them. And, like that seems normal protocol for any sort of investigation, is that you don't really announce it publicly. Yeah. But this is kind of a different, if you're doing a criminal investigation, obviously you don't want to put it in the newspaper. We're investigating this guy for criminal behavior. But when it's a public official, and the whole point is to provide the semblance that your institutions are working and holding like public officials accountable, that it's a little bit different there, I suppose.
Yeah. Because I remember when that happened, for me at least, it felt like it was a preemptive sort of punishment. Like it took the election away from her and stuff before the investigation had even been followed through on. So it would seem that releasing a brief that the investigation is happening has the same impact as saying something along the lines of like, we have found some things about her or whatever. And it seems to me that if you were to release that early, knowing that it would hurt her campaign, that you're punishing her before you've even figured out if there was any wrongdoing there, because the political implications were predictable, I think.
And the real villain there, in my opinion, is people's media literacy. Like the average person who reads that somebody's being investigated for something and their mind goes, oh, they're guilty of something. Maybe it shouldn't be a big deal to announce that somebody's being investigated for something.
Yeah. But when we are talking about holding our political leaders accountable, and that is the purpose of it and stuff like that, then I think we also have to look at those political repercussions, in the context of the political repercussion. Like if you're going to be saying you're going to do the investigation, that'll carry with it a political impact because of the media literacy of
course.
Yeah. And that was my thoughts at the time. It was like, oh, okay, you're throwing this lady's whole campaign off preemptively without even having finished your investigation and stuff. So it wouldn't matter if it had found absolutely nothing. You're kind of just jumping the gun.
However this bears out legally, you should know that the implication is that, like, extra legally, you doing this, Comey, is like having an impact on the political process, right?
Yeah. And I even feel like that with a lot of the Trump investigations and stuff, like similarly on the other side, where like they're announced, a commission is announced, or investigations into his taxes are announced, but they're still investigations and they don't have conclusions, but people hear that and then immediately jump to like, oh, he's going to be found guilty of this, that, or the other thing because the investigation itself is happening.
Yeah, or even worse, people just hope that it's going to turn out in something, and so they start arguing about what the results are going to be, and then when that happens, one side is determined to fucking look like an ass at the end of it. So
yeah, and like we even saw this with the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp stuff. It seems like people had their character that they were rooting for the entire time without like a good understanding of the justice system or even how well the arguments are playing out for the judge and stuff. It felt like a lot of us were still in the dark about how things would actually turn out, but had very strong opinions one way or the other.
Yeah, that seems about par for the course for any sort of current events topic.
Do you think that the Republicans are like ontologically evil?
No, of course not.
Do you think they would be receptive to like the widespread implementation of like, conversion camp therapy or things like this if their constituency was down for it?
Yeah, probably. I think that would be honestly responsible representation. That's what happens in a democracy, for better or for worse.
Mm.
If your constituency is down for something and it has popular will, if it's not enshrined in the Constitution that a person will be protected against something like conversion therapy or something like that, then that's what you get to have.
Yeah, because like when Vosh is talking about like the groundwork is laid and the Republicans have shown that they're anti-democracy or that they're anti-LGBT and all this stuff, like a part of me is like, well, that part is correct. I do think that if there was, you know, a single instance of like a trans shooter going after a lawmaker or something like that, then things could shift very quickly to be very bad for trans people. And I think having some acute awareness that we're at that point now is worthwhile, even if calling it a genocide or something like that to me feels like a hyperbole. I do think that recognizing that the groundwork has been laid for some of these things is important. I'm curious if you would agree or not.
Okay, so first off, I should caveat that I'm not super sure on the state of legislation against something like conversion therapy. I know that a bunch of like, or I'm fairly certain that a bunch that like there are some medical committees or medical communities that have sort of joined together to ban conversion therapy in different states or something like that. I'm not sure what weight that has legally or something like that. So there, you know, there may already be something in place similar to like a Civil Rights Act against conversion therapy that, you know, necessarily precludes the legal status of something like that even occurring at this point, maybe by state. But when it comes to whether or not Republicans are like anti-LGBT, I think that they are, and I think that there's no greater example than that being true, or of that being true, than the Trump trans military ban. I don't think that there's a single good. I mean, that's a perfect, I think, perfect example of just conservatives. The majority of conservatives supported that trans military ban, although it was a small majority. It was between 50 and 60%. So it was just barely over half, if I remember correctly, according to like Pew Research polling. There was no reason to do it. It was against the advisement of you know, military chiefs of staff. Every single, you know, chief of staff of the Joint Chiefs said that there was no reason to do it. It would cost more than it was worth. There was like not a functional reason to do it. In order to defend it, everybody had to pretend to be a military expert. Lots of people proclaiming to have some knowledge or expertise on what it is to be a soldier, or what, you know, reasons why a transgender person couldn't be a soldier, a sailor, or something like that. Everybody talking out of their ass, and they, you know, had no idea what they were talking about. And yet it had majority support among Republican voters.
Do you think
I haven't yet heard an argument for how that was justified, other than just sort of a reaction in hatred and misunderstanding towards transgender people.
the tough thing is not being like a military expert or even having been in the military myself? I find it difficult to parse through those arguments because like I don't have a BS filter tuned into it, which is why it made it hard for me to like interpret what was going on with that when it was happening.
Yeah, so a lot of people would talk about how the military needs to be a fighting force and why you need the most physically capable people, this, that, or the other. But it was absent the information that like a very small percentage of people in even an active duty military are filling combat roles. You know, the overwhelming majority of people in the military are filling some clerical or logistical or intellectual or engineering, you know, roles or something like that. They don't ever need to fill a combat role. It just didn't make any sense. And, you know, personally, I served with a bunch of trans men and trans women in the military and it never posed a problem. Yeah.
Okay. Out of curiosity, as a bit of a tangent, what do you feel about lowering standards for like military fitness for combat specific troops that are women? So like having there be lesser physical requirements because of your gender.
Okay. I feel like this is a question for like a general or something, or somebody who organizes a combat force. I was a lowly, you know, technical worker, right? So I did have some leadership training and I have some leadership experience, but I'm not like in charge of organizing a strategic force. But that's what it would come down to. If you were going to do that, it would be a way. I'll tell you this. So there's disparate physical, like physical fitness standards for males and females, and the military, or at least the Navy, when I served, was very careful to use those terms, male and female. If you ever said men or women in boot camp, they would actually like reprimand you and reinforce this terminology, male and female. There's disparate physical fitness standards, and it seems like the reason they are disparate is because the standards are there to require reasonably a similar level of training to reach us like different results, right? If they were to do away with the female standard and employ only the male standard, well, then basically there would not be a single female in the military. right? Or there would be like 3 or something like that.
Mm.
The standards are very disparate when it comes to like upper body fitness, and the run was there was a bit of a difference there as well. But yeah, when it comes to combat, obviously the argument has to hold true there, where it's like, okay, we need the most physically capable people. There's no equal opportunity on the battlefield. That being said, you can increase your fighting force by creating a disparate standard. It's similar to why you would say, here's why we would introduce a disparate physical fitness standard to allow like females to serve in the military without lowering the standard too much for males or whatever at all, is because it increases the size of the force. Suddenly you open the ability to serve in the military and the many functions that need to be served in the military to the other 50% of your nation's population. And if we were really, really hurting for active combatants, which I think the need for active combatants, like boots on ground combatants, is just, becoming lower and lower because of the state of drones and, remote warfare, electronic warfare, cyber warfare becoming more prominent, that sort of thing. But if there was like a big surge in boots on ground stuff and we just needed more bodies than there were males willing to fill combat roles, then your options are between a draft or to start, changing regulations to allow, like females into a combat force and creating a second fitness standard for them or something. It's not a very sexy answer, but I think that's the real answer, is that you just have to you have to generate policies to fit the needs of the mission.
Yeah. I mean, it's the pragmatic answer, like the realistic one. Do you think that the Republicans are anti-democracy or anti-democratic in what they're going for?
It's so hard to comment on this with such a broad brush, because even, I don't know, I think that there are, highly politically charged people on any side of the political spectrum are willing to sort of make concessions against democracy when it suits them, and willing to fight for democracy when they're losing, right? Like when they feel that more democratic representation or something that enhances democratic representation for their side is going to help their side win or something. I don't think this is something that's exclusive to conservatives. Yeah, I think this is just like people want their team to win. There's a wide gamut of people supporting either political team, right? Like you've got the blue-haired SJWs, but you also have a lot of academic, sort of Democrat people, or like liberal people, more adult. And it's the same with conservatives. You have more reserved, sort of mature, even academic conservatives. And you also have, the pickup truck conservatives, that sort of thing, that just want to see their guy win as well.
But I feel at least that between the Democrats and between the Republicans, it seems like the Republicans are more willing to engage in anti-democratic practices to enable their side to win. Do you feel the same, or do you still feel like it's more or less even on the both sides?
I think the issue that illustrates this best is like gerrymandering. I think a lot of left-leaning people, when they believe that gerrymandering is something that overwhelmingly benefits Republicans, they're fighting tooth and nail to get rid of it. But when they recognize where gerrymandering really helps Democrats, they play the game, and they want to redistrict to favor Democrats. I think IRI is a good person to talk to about this. I think he has more insight in this sort of thing, but that's my basic fundamental understanding. And I've met no shortage of people on either side of this issue, on either side of the political aisle. Conservatives who say that gerrymandering helps Democrats, and it does in certain places, around urban places especially. That makes a lot of sense, right? Like any surrounding county that's more rural of an urban place, it only makes sense to try and dole out your liberal population, to soak up more counties or whatever.
Yeah.
And I've seen a lot of left-leaning people talking about how the only reason Republicans have any power is because of gerrymandering, or because they fight dirty or something like that.
One thing that Vosh talked a lot about is when you pull the alarm to label something a genocide or an impending genocide, because if you do it too early, there are obvious consequences. However, things can snowball so very, very quickly that doing it too late can have even more consequences. And so that's why he's erring on the side of pointing it out early. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think that's kind of dangerous. The way that he sort of likens what's happening right now to LGBT people to like the Jews in Nazi Germany is quite a stretch. Yeah, I don't know. There are some parallels, but they're pretty weak, right? Like the obvious argument against that is that like LGBT people don't have any sort of like hegemony in the United States. Whereas like the Volk in Germany under Nazi Germany, my understanding is that like the whole point where they were being energized to be upset with Jewish people was they were told that the Jews had all the money and the power in the society. And I don't think anybody could ever argue that that's like true by any stretch in the United States. But there are conservatives that will argue that like LGBT people have cultural hegemony, and I think that's true to some degree in some forms of media. I think I don't think it's a bad thing though. I don't think it's like nefarious or like malignant or anything like that. But yeah, that's a very very loose parallel though.
Yeah, I think that from my understanding, there's a lot of fears around pointing them as the reason that things are wrong. So maybe part of the reason that the left is going so far into the realm of like sexual freedom and destroying maybe some of the cultural ideas that Republican voters would agree with is in large part because of trans groups or gay groups that necessitate these kinds of cultural changes in order to be happy with where the status quo is at. And I think that that's part of the alarming rhetoric that Vosh is pointing out there.
Yeah, I'm curious what kind of majority that really constitutes in terms of conservative thought, though. Like, I know that idea exists, but I don't know how many people really agree with it. But it's so easily refuted by, hey, motherfucker, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness without infringing on the happiness of others. You just, you got to let people be. Separation of church and state and all that stuff. I feel like we already have those arguments cut out for us by our forefathers.
Yeah, and I don't see it brought up nearly as much as it should be, this separation of church and state as part of the reason why we shouldn't take too seriously like what certain groups of constituents want. But that also goes against what we talked about earlier, where you're very pro like if your constituency wants to go one way, then your job as a politician is to enact policies that are in line with what that constituency wants. So when that constituency is deeply religious and they're sharing a lot of the ideals of their religion through their advocacy, then how do we kind of balance that out a little bit?
Yep. Yeah, that's kind of one of the unfortunate paradoxes of a democracy is that like, your leaders end up being a reflection of political will. And if the political will swings in a way that's even antithetical to the precepts of the nation or what's laid out by the Constitution, like a voter can be guilty of as many contradictions as they want, right? And so by that virtue, like whomever those voters elect is going to reflect those contradictions, and they have to do so unapologetically in an ideal democracy, right?
Yeah.
In the most pure form of a democracy.
Yeah. Getting back to the kind of Republicans being anti-democracy, one thing that was pointed out to me is that a non-zero number of Republicans are tied to overthrowing the results of an election or being okay with what happened on January 6th, which we'll talk about a bit more later. And you can't point to good parallels from elected Democrats. Can you, off the top of your head, come up with something like that, or do you feel like that is a difference between the parties presently?
I think it is a difference. And I think, January 6th compared to when Trump took office. Do you remember when Trump took office? There was that woman with the yellow safety jacket.
Donald J. Trump is now president of the United States. President Obama is the ex-president.
She was made a meme of forever, for a time eternal, or I don't know how they identify or whatever. But that was the Republican response to the liberal response to Trump being elected, is they're just a bunch of crybabies. Look, they showed up, they held their signs, and they cried. And then what did Republicans do? They cried so hard, they kicked and screamed to the point where they stormed the halls. They couldn't accept it so much. They were like, oh, look at these baby liberals. They can't accept that Trump won the election. And what happened when Trump lost? I think if those conservatives wanted to be consistent, they would have to recognize that everybody that showed up at January 6th was an even bigger baby than all the people they laughed at to protest Trump winning the election, I think.
Yeah. And another point along the same veins that was kind of bouncing around the back of my head, but Goids points out in the chat, is that when you were talking about gerrymandering earlier, sure, there are Democrats that might be in support of that if it helps them win races and stuff like that. But when you look at which political party is pushing more for independent commissions that would kind of solve that problem or work towards solving that problem, you see that Democrats are way more in favor of that than the Republicans. So while they might be in favor of gerrymandering if it helps them in some cases, they're also overwhelmingly represented in being the party that pushes for independent commissions to solve that problem as well.
I've heard that's true, and IRI has told me that, so I'm happy to grant that, I guess. I haven't personally looked that up, but I accept that that's probably true. But yeah, I don't know, or that might be true. I don't even know. I feel like I'm agreeing to this too strongly for even my own tastes right now. But that may be true, but it still just seems like a really difficult problem, because what are the alternatives? It seems like there's a lot of reading I would have to do to really be able to make sense of this, because I don't know, it's really, really complicated. And a lot of what people think that gerrymandering doesn't even matter for things like presidential elections, which are the only elections most people even pay attention to, because we have, it's all or nothing. It's on the state level. Gerrymandering has nothing to do with it.
And I don't feel bad about you being more hesitant. I feel like a huge part of your brand is recognizing when you know about something or don't know about something, or when you've read about something and you haven't. And that hesitancy, I think, is what kind of separates you from a lot of other political people in this space. So if anything, I think that it's something more people should probably be appreciative of. But yeah. Like, do you feel like that's a strong part of your brand that you want to keep up, or have you been tempted to jump more into like just voicing your opinion, even if it's not like 110% researched?
Well, I'm always tempted because it's good for business. The number one political voice on Twitch is the number one political voice because he does just that. Just says a bunch of shit that's knee-jerk, his feelings about a bunch of stuff he doesn't understand, and he's filthy rich. So of course I'm tempted. It's bad for business. I'm glad you appreciate it. It seems that it's a miracle to me that I've accrued any semblance of a following or an audience, given that this is my brand, shouting "I don't know" from the rooftops. I wish more people did it. I think it's more responsible, but it's bad for business.
Yeah. And the other thing is, like, I think part of why it's good for business is like, we all see things that we kind of accept to be truths, and I'm not sure if we would be super willing to shake on it. So like, for instance, like, I think it is fairly apparent that of the two parties, the Republicans are way more anti-democratic. Like, if I had to pick one or the other, it's not a coin toss for me. I really do feel like it's obvious that the Republicans are more anti-democratic.
Okay. You know what? I'm happy to agree with that now, because I'm now thinking about, I guess, like the history of measures the Republican Party has sort of collectively taken to try to limit people's access to voting and stuff by creating like sort of arbitrary barriers and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So you know what? I think I am happy to say that Republicans are sort of more anti-democratic. Yeah, I can't think of anything on the Democrat side that does anything but try to expand access to voting, and it seems that Republicans go the opposite way. Yeah, I think that's the biggest part of the calculation for me.
Yeah, and we didn't even get into that until this point. Like, the restrictions on voting access in a lot of the southern states in particular is like a huge thing. Like, when we were in Georgia, that was a huge part of canvassing, at least in my experience, was like, at some point I had moved from like always pushing the Democrats and whatever to just generally like every door that I knocked on, making sure people know that even if you registered, your vote might not be counted. And there's a huge list of votes that aren't being counted for one reason or another, because of the bureaucracy that's set up in Georgia. And it seemed like everybody just intuitively understood that, oh yeah, the state is probably fucking with my vote. Let me go ahead and check that. Where do I go and check that my vote is being counted? Almost as if it were a given. And if I lived in a state like that, that would be really off-putting. And I think that's specifically a problem with a lot of these Republican places. But
yeah.
And to Plutarch in the chat, in case you missed the whole rhetoric advice that I gave about how to word an opinion so that it's helpful for this conversation, if you say that's ridiculous and that's all you tell me, it doesn't help us to move the conversation forward. If you have like a question or something or like a counter example, you could bring it up, and I'm reading through a lot of those in the chat. But if you just say that's ridiculous, like...
Well, who even knows with Plutarch, that motherfucker, his opinion might be pieced out of a bunch of details that may change one by one over time. And in the end, is it still the same opinion?
Yeah. Yeah. And if we knew the pieces that constituted his current opinion, we could pick through it. But knowing nothing besides the fact that they think it's ridiculous, can't go further from there. I'm happy to hear you come back around on the Republican thing, because it seems like we could go down a long list of all these things that might be in the back of our minds and not at the forefront, but it would seem that of the two parties, they're obviously the more anti-democratic one, which is why...
Damn, you're really selling this.
Well, because like... I see a lot of people going really, really hard against Vosh, and you know how I am with counter jerks. Like, you may disagree with the conclusions he's reaching about the genocide and stuff, but the individual pieces that are making it up, I don't think are necessarily things that I would argue against. So, like, if you're worried about the dismantling of democracy by the Republicans because of their largely anti-democratic streak, then I feel like that is something that is okay to be worried about. And if you're worried about the way they would treat LGBT people or the way that they would ignore a certain voter base because of those anti-democratic processes, and they're kind of rallying against the LGBT people in a lot of different places and with a lot of different representatives, like, I don't feel like that is a problematic thing to be worried about either. I just think it's that when we get to the point of calling it a genocide that you lose me. But like the steps getting there, I think you had me all the way up to that point pretty much.
I don't. To be fair, to be maximally fair, I don't think he's calling it a genocide as much as he's saying this is the the crumb trail that normally leads to a genocide or something. Which I am not sure he has the information to make that calculation. But for me, where he crosses the line is saying things like,
remember during the Black Lives Matter rallies, there were like those Patriot Prayer dumb fucks rolling their $60,000 trucks through like urban neighborhoods with a bunch of guys with guns in the pickup trucks. When that happens, I want people to be able to take shots at them from apartment windows.
Yeah. So it is very easy to read into that way, but to be uber charitable, perhaps beyond where we should be charitable, because even Steven did this in the conversation we had the other day. Like,
if I'm trying to be ultra charitable, maybe Vosh means that if they were being threatened with guns from those guys in the trucks, you should be able to shoot at them.
So that seems to be the larger context there. But the clip itself is bad because he's not that specific. And like you said, it's a very different statement from the ones who referred to Destiny making and the situations Destiny was talking about, because the situations that underlie what Destiny is talking about are not hypothetical. They're actually things that are happening right now, whereas he's talking about a possible future, or a very possible future, where like these things are happening and then you're doing these things, whereas Steven's talking about like what is happening right now and what the response ought to be or what would be justified.
Yeah, I mean, you asked me to critique his rhetoric on the subject, and that's my criticism on his rhetoric. Yeah,
fair enough.
I can accept that he probably meant something more specific, but I'm critiquing him on what he said and what similar to Comey and Hillary, right? Like, whatever the protocol is and whatever the reason is, whatever the principled stance should be in terms of how to interpret something like that, you also have to try to calculate what possible sort of repercussions there can be, and being a little bit fast and loose with your language can be. And I think that's fast and loose. I think it's too fast and loose.
Yeah. I think kind of one last thing here. So I think that there is some value, although you can debate on which scenarios you would do this in, of being a little hyperbolic about what's going on, like having a phrase or something like that is kind of past the point of what's going on, but is meant to like encapsulate the idea so that people can talk about it. I wouldn't be cool with that in terms of like calling something a genocide when you don't think it's quite there yet, but I would in other situations. What do you think the value is in being hyperbolic to start conversations?
It's rough. I'm not sure. I'm pretty divided on this. Okay. Last night I saw Everything Everywhere All at Once. And this is how I'm going to segue in us talking about this if we're going to talk about it. But I don't know if do we want to say it's spoilers territory? The movie's been in theaters for weeks now.
Well, we could give an announcement now about spoilers unless you want to talk about it more generally.
Okay, here's what I have to say. That movie, it felt like I was very fortunate that that movie offered a lot of insight on some things that I'm struggling with. And one of the things that I'm struggling with right now is this sort of conundrum where I am looking at Twitter and I don't follow anybody on Twitter. And one of the benefits that brings me is I get to see some of the more general, basically just the most popular signals in a given field. Now, what Twitter shows me is going to be dependent on what I've looked at most recently or engaged with most recently, depending on the topic. But it seems like what it's showing me is just the most popular things in those topics. So it shows me a lot of political stuff, and it shows me the most popular things in the political realm. And the most popular signals are just the most reductive, like stupid, fucking missing the point, completely void of nuance, sort of political opinions you can have. But they're the most agreeable. And they're also some of the most dishonest. And it's very irritating to me. Like it completely black pills me. Like what's the emoji where it's like the PLS emoji where the guy's just completely black circled in, his eyes are completely hollowed out and everything around him is black. It really, really bugs me that this is how people find their way to most of their like insight into the world that they live in is basically just built out of a cardboard frame, and it's just completely false. Not completely false, but it's like an amusement park setting, right? Where it's like all sort of made out of styrofoam and painted over, where like all the information that people are building their opinions out of is false in just like it's false in one detail, but it's a really, really important detail. I retweeted something today where it was like the guy sweating over pressing the buttons, except he was just pressing both buttons. And one of the buttons said, we can't afford to pay our employees more, and bragging about our profits this quarter. And then the second panel, it showed the guy giving a thumbs up, and behind him it said every company. It's like, okay, the overwhelming majority of businesses fail within like 5 years or less, I think. So I just posted a graph of like Bureau of Labor Statistics, like the average lifespan of a given business. It's very low. Yeah. And like, is there truth to the idea that workers need to bargain for their labor? We have to have some mechanism to enable people who perform like the lowest forms of labor, the most unskilled types of labor, most replaceable types of labor. They have to have some way to bargain for themselves so that they can get a better life for themselves. Yeah. We don't want businesses exploiting people to the degree that they're living like shitty lives, right? But we have to have that standard of living, or that like the minimum wage or what have you, to be low enough that businesses can afford to succeed. Because if no business can be viable, businesses have to be viable to exist, to like allow for an economy in the first place. And we don't want to have a system where every single person who attempts to go into business for themselves is guaranteed to fail because wages are too high or something like that. And it's already at the point, I think, where it's pretty consistent that a business is going to fail. Now, whether that's due to wages or other considerations, people just generally being being poor at finance or whatever, we want more people going into business in general and like taking that risk. And as it is now, of the people who take that risk, the majority fail. But yeah, like that's a position. But this comic doesn't really do well to illustrate that position. All this comic is telling you is that every company is just greedy and wants to fuck you over and lie to you or something like that. And that everybody who runs a company, I saw that comic and I was like, damn, I should go into business. I guess I could just fucking lie to people and I'll be successful. I'll be able to brag about all my profits. But yeah, it's not how it works, unfortunately.
Do you feel like there's been a transition of moving from the rhetoric of like trans erasure to trans genocide? Like in your mind, are these two things that are as similarly related as perhaps they would be in mine? Because I feel like that's what we've hopped over to with the genocide thing, that it's a new version of just saying trans erasure that's a bit more, has a bit more force and is meant to get more people talking about it, which it has been successful at doing, to be fair. But
okay, I think this is people being a little bit loose with the term genocide, because I don't think there's a hereditary component when we consider, like, LGBTQ people. Like, obviously, we want to not preclude, like, people from being queer or whatever in society, right? Like, and obviously it's a problem if we start legislating away people's right to be queer. But a genocide is about, like, ending a lineage of something, and that's like, sure, something can have that effect if you create enough fear in the society from identifying as a given thing. But, like, the operative term of genocide is gene, right? Of, like, the genealogy, you're ending the bloodline of something. So, like, I'm not sure, like, this is where I would draw a distinction between trans erasure and genocide. You asked me to draw a distinction, this is where I'm going to draw it. I think the concerns are similar. Yeah. Like, whether I would use that word, I would be a little more careful about using that word, because I think we're already being a little bit too loose with its usage nowadays. But yeah.
Yeah. And do you feel like it is a natural extension of what used to be called trans erasure, or is that connection maybe dubious?
I mean, are you asking me if when Vosh calls it a trans genocide, is that an extension of trans erasure? I think it's more than trans. Well, I guess I would have to understand what exactly is trans erasure.
So my understanding is that gets to, like, the erasure of the identity, or the prevention of people from, like, fulfilling that identity, whether that's through, like, gender reaffirming care, or broader healthcare access to hormones, or pedo jacketing them and stuff like that.
Is it hide the fact that they exist from society, but they can exist, or is it we need to forcibly remove people from identifying as this thing and, like, force them to live a different life?
Remove people from identifying this thing, like, bring into question the very, like, nature of transness as a real thing, and label it as
sure.
Then
else. It's the same idea. I would say it's an extension. Yeah, it's the same idea.
Yeah. How would you define genocide?
I guess knee jerk, I would define genocide as, like, ending an entire, like, ethnicity's ability to continue propagating, or, like, from history.
And what are your feelings on the 10 stages that have kind of been making the rounds as people's justification for why there's a trans genocide right now?
Can we go through them?
Sure, if you want to. So I'll just read it out to people just real quick. So number 1 is going to be classification. People are divided into them and us. Number 2 is symbolization. When combined with hatred, symbols may be forced upon unwilling members of pariah groups, like putting on the Star of David. Discrimination, law or cultural power excludes these groups from full civil rights. Segregation or apartheid laws, denial of voting rights. One group, number 4 is dehumanization. One group denies the humanity of the other group. Members of it are equated with animals, vermin, insects, diseases. 5 is organization. So special army units or militias are often trained and armed, or government bodies are created to deal with these people. Polarization is number 6, which that's hate groups broadcasting polarizing propaganda. Number 7 is preparation. Mass killing is planned and victims are identified and separated because of their ethnic or religious or etc. identity. 8 is persecution, where expropriation, forced displacement, ghettos, and concentration camps are used to put them into. 9 is extermination, which I feel like is self-explanatory. And then 10 is denial, where they deny that any crimes are committed. Now, an important thing to keep in mind when reading through all these is that the author of it has said themselves that they're not meant to happen in any particular order, and they can mix and match. So that's important to keep in mind.
Okay, for mainstream Republicans, I guess, or conservatives, I would say that 1 is definitely true. That's a yes on 1. So the classification, people are divided into them and us. I think that happens. 2, symbolization. When combined with hatred, symbols may be forced upon unwilling members of pariah groups. I don't think that's, like, the whole making Jews wear the Star of David or something like that. Like, I don't think we're there. Discrimination, law or cultural power excludes groups from full civil rights. Segregation or apartheid laws, denial of voting rights. I guess there are arguments for how this one applies, but it's kind of shaky. I would say that this one is pretty blurry. Obviously not for denial of voting rights. Segregation or apartheid laws. So, like, people not being able to identify in certain ways in certain places, or the whole bathroom discussion kind of borders on that, but I think it's pretty shaky.
Or denial of medical rights, which I think is what we're seeing now with trans people, like not letting people be below a certain age do gender affirming care, or making it more difficult to get access to hormone therapy for trans people, I think would be number 3.
Yeah, I think that's the best argument for number 3. Yep. Dehumanization. One group denies the humanity of the other group. Members that are treated with animals, vermin, insects, or diseases. That one is even like still pretty shaky. I think the furthest we get on number 4 is like, they're indoctrinating our kids. They're like influencing my kid to be like, LGBT if they wouldn't have otherwise, or something like that. And I guess to that extent, it's being equated with a disease. But I think that's different than like outright calling them vermin, or I guess some of the rhetoric around like saying that it's deteriorating like traditional family values or something may have that effect. But again, it's, I guess, as innocuous as it could be while still qualifying.
Yeah, and one thing to keep in mind as we go through this is from a time before the internet. On the internet, if you look for it, you can find people that call trans people animals, degenerate, subhuman, that they have a sickness or something wrong with them. They need to get therapy for what's wrong with them, that it won't be solved through medical practices or stuff like that. And that's why kids shouldn't be able to do it. They should just be talked to through it. So a lot of these, you can find people advocating for them online, but it may not be at the government level. It may be in certain social groups. And if it is at the government level, it may be a handful of lawmakers and not necessarily like an entire political party or institution.
Even before the internet, I would be just a guess. I would guess that any person who was like transgender before the age of the internet has probably encountered pretty regularly people, saying exactly those things that you say they might find in like niche internet, communities or whatever, about how trans people are, they need to get therapy, or they're just confused or whatever, or even that they're a blight on society or a scourge, or they're ungodly or whatever.
Yeah.
I don't think the introduction of the internet really even makes that, really changes the dynamics there very much.
Well, I just think that if you're going out with the presumption that this is a genocide that is happening, you can fill out as many of these steps as possible. I just think it makes it easier for you to fill them out, because you could go in many corners of the internet to find this. On another topic that keeps getting brought up to me this entire stream that we've been talking about, this is the pedophile jacketing of trans people or of gay people, that they're that they're groomers, that could fall under that stage. I want to say that you have to realize that when you're calling pedophiles and you're putting them in this group of this discrimination thing, you're also being like uber against pedophiles, which it seems to me that like is something that like happens to people. And it, like, I don't know, it feels really weird to me that under dehumanization would be calling people pedophiles, because then you're saying that people with pedophilia or that are pedophilic are necessarily less than human. And it's like, okay, well, hold on, let's be a little careful here. Like, it's bad to call them groomers and stuff just by virtue of falling under LGBT, but like let's be careful with the dehumanization for pedophilic people. I don't know.
Yeah, I understand, and I agree in general. It's like it would be like the same as saying such and such group is dehumanized by being called criminals or something, when you could just as easily, provide some good examples or arguments for why people who become criminals, there may be some sociological reasons for that or something like that.
Yeah. Like, it gets into weird territory where it's like, okay, let's maybe not use that one as an example here, because you're necessarily saying something about that group. Like, this is talking about not humans, so like animals, vermin, insects, etc.
Right.
What about number 5 here?
Number 5, organizations, special army units or militias? Obviously not. I think that's a hard no on that one.
But to stretch it, maybe this, because I think I've seen this where they fit into number 5, the idea that there are bodies, governmental bodies, that are behind the enforcement of things, like not allowing parents to transition their children early, or if they do start doing that, to charge them with child abuse. Then you're using an arm of the state to carry out these laws that are against trans people. So I guess in that regard, perhaps they could
I
fit
would put
5.
that, no, that's too much of a stretch, and I would say that
Okay.
already qualifies under number 3, right? The segregation or apartheid law.
Yeah, I suppose so. I didn't think about that. All right, polarization.
Hate groups broadcast polarizing propaganda. That's a definite yes. I mean, that's a hard yes. As long as what's his name? The conservative radio personality that was on air forever, who died recently.
Rush Limbaugh?
That's the one.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, as long as Rush Limbaugh has been around, number 5 has been true, or number 6 rather.
Yeah.
Or as long as the churches, the Christian churches had power in the United States, I think that's been true.
Preparation.
Mass killing is planned. Victims are identified and separated because of their ethnic or religious identity. That's an obvious no, I think.
One thing I'm struggling with in here is it feels like this isn't meant to be a definition of genocide because it's self-referential. Like in number 5, organization, we're talking about organizing around committing a genocide. So it begs the question of what the genocide itself means. Like it almost seems like these are steps that are not meant to define when a genocide is happening. They're meant to like identify after a genocide has already been recognized, what were the steps that had led up to it. Like, because like for number 7 and number 5, it seems like, okay, well, mass killing or putting people in camps or whatever, like preparation will be required, organization will be required to do those things, but those things themselves are what makes the genocide. But it's just my opinion.
Yeah, I think you're right.
All right, then we have persecution.
Expropriation, forced displacement, ghettos, concentration camps. No, I don't think we're there. Not even close.
No. Although if we more broadly define persecution, perhaps they are persecuted in particular states, but definitely none of these.
But again, that would fall under number 3, probably, right?
Yeah, discrimination for sure.
Or one of the other ones.
Yeah, although if they started making it mandatory that parents send their young children who identify as trans to conversion therapy camps, I think that would hit.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah,
I think you're right. But those are, I think those are illegal now. I can't remember if this was just like basically 100% of the nation's like medical associations have said we're just not going to practice this, or it may be illegal in some states, but in effect I think it might be illegal everywhere in the United States, or just not in practice.
I am not sure.
Maybe short of like South Carolina or something, or
well, if this map is up to date on Wiki and we could trust them, it would appear that there's a large portion of the United States that hasn't banned it yet.
Yeah, like I said, it may not be like legally banned in all places, but it's like either legally banned or like medical associations for a given states just say that they won't sanction it.
Gotcha.
Something to look into.
Yeah, for sure. And banning the use of state and federal funds would be different than banning the practice itself as well.
Correct.
Okay. All right, what do we have next here? Extermination.
Let me just make it clear that I don't know if what I just said is true. So anybody listening, I invite anybody to fact check me on that, and I hope you reach out to me and email me or something and let me know, because I want to know.
Yeah. And Vels noted that they believe the creator of this said the list isn't supposed to tell you if a genocide is happening. It's not like you hit a certain number and then it's definitely genocide. It's more like, here are 10 things to watch out for that can signal a genocide. Although I don't think that would make much of a difference to the people advocating that there is a genocide right now, because they would say, well, the indication of it seems like a pretty, it's a canary in the coal mine type of thing. But
sure.
We're definitely not exterminating people. Definitely not at 9.
Looking at the definition, it's that the removal of them would be considered an extermination, not that an extermination is occurring. It is extermination to the killers because they do not believe their victims to be fully human. But I don't see how this is different than dehumanization, I guess. But yeah, I guess we can agree that it's definitely not happening in action. not at a systemic level. I'm sure that, there's like anti-LGBT hate crimes that end in the deaths of people. I wouldn't really contest that if you told me that was true. Whatever. I'm sure that there's examples of that in recent history. But yeah, even that it would happen, there's probably a fair bit of Americans that would consider that you're just like removing the scourge of society or something.
Yeah, this seems to be a compound one. I feel like it would be better to label this one killing, because it seems to be a compound of killing and then the kind of dehumanization that had happened at step 4, and that seems to make up extermination. And then 10, I guess it has to actually happen before we can deny it. Like, that'd be an interesting thing in an argument, is if somebody is pro the 10 stages indicating that we have a genocide right now, but they're anti the idea that we've reached stage 10, then necessarily they would think that like it hasn't happened, right? And then we could start there with them, I suppose.
I think if we wanted to go a little bit abstract with this one, I would say that this one actually, I would say a partial yes to 10.
Okay.
Because I do think that a big part of like the conservative platform right now is denying that like the legislation that they're approaching, and a big part of the culture war that they're fighting is in effect, like reaching number 3 and number 4 and, some of the other things on this list. Lauren Southern was streaming not long ago, and it was on Twitch, so it was just before she got banned, maybe within the past 2 months. And I was busy. I was doing homework. She invited like leftists to come on and talk with her, and I was like tempted, but I was just too busy, unfortunately. But she was on this whole rant about how the liberals need to believe that conservatives are actually like hateful towards trans people. They just need to believe we hate trans people. And I really wanted to hop on and like pose the question of the Trump LGBT military ban to her, because I just think that that's a silver bullet to the idea that like there's no undue discrimination or prejudice against like LGBT people, and like specifically trans people. So I think that a big part of the platform is denying that in effect, like the things that conservatives are approaching is discriminatory and is like a undue prejudice towards trans people. So yeah, I don't know. I would say a partial yes to 10 for that reason.
Okay. Well, that is all the stages. I was given another link, which I'll go ahead and shoot to you after I switch scenes so I don't leak all of our DMs. There you go. So this has some international law and the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, and this is the definition that they use, so it seems like to read it out for the audio listeners. In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, such as killing the members, causing serious bodily harm or mental harm to the members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, or forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So like, I think some of these we could argue are hit and some of them are not. Do you want to go through this one as well or not?
I guess, I mean, like the door is just wide open on this one with that clause of in part. Like that's my biggest problem with this phrasing, I guess. But yeah, I don't think we can talk about it. I mean, it's content, I guess. But
yeah, I think a key crux to that whole C is calculated. So the intention behind doing it has to be to destroy this group in whole or in part. And I'm not necessarily sure if denying trans care or whatever is necessarily calculated to destroy trans people. But
I think there's a good argument that it is when it's paired with rhetoric about how it's like an emblem of the erosion of the traditional family and family values, and how that's causing all these other problems in society, and we've lost our way and all these other things.
But I haven't heard that rhetoric brought up, and this may happen with the lawmakers pushing for the things limiting trans access to healthcare at a young age, though, because they seem to pitch it as being
Let's have a smell, all right?
Help these kids or whatever.
Ooh, wafting.
Or yeah, to
Likes
provide rights to the parents. I think is the typical framing.
Right,
It's
oh,
not so much about like helping the kids, but not precluding the parents from having the right to be a part of their child's like identity and stuff like that, or healthcare, or to keep the doctors from indoctrinating your kids and force feminizing or whatever, force gayizing your kids under your nose or something.
Yeah.
But even that, I think there's some consideration to be made about the fact that the vocal minority, like that some of what maybe some politicians do is dress up the more hateful ideas of a vocal minority into a more or a less, sort of a more insidious but like more innocuous, sort of more acceptable political dialogue. So, for example, the whole like signaling to parents to sort of key in on their fears that a doctor may like give a child hormone treatment or puberty blockers without the parents' consent, or I guess like intentionally without the parents' consent because they think the parent may be abusive over it or something like that. I think that's something that sort of generally resonates, but the political will to push for this may be coming from like more hateful, sort of more that like traditional family values and like queer ideology is eroding the traditional family values and shit like that. It's hard to know, but yeah.
What do you think about the argument that if your opponents are suiciding themselves and you're denying them care that may lead to an increase in suicidality, then you are necessarily trying to destroy them because it'll have that impact?
I think that's like a few moves beyond the level of chess that like, conservative voters and lawmakers are making personally.
Okay. Because to me,
I think
it's
that's
like,
I understand.
Yeah, that's an interesting extrapolation. And like, I can't genuinely imagine that there are people that are like really making that calculation in their head, but who knows? Maybe. I doubt it though.
Yeah. And even if it was a it's so many steps. Like I just I feel like I have
that also doesn't like preclude the thing from occurring. It just means that like of the ones that emerge, they're just gonna like kill themselves. But that doesn't really like help their goals at all either, right?
Yeah. It's just every time I hear that, it's like eating something that has like a weird texture and taste and smell to it. Like I just immediately have like a negative response to it, and I can't put it into words, but I just feel like we should focus on any other argument because this one feels convoluted to me.
Okay, my knee-jerk reaction is that it's too smart for the type of person that's going to be arguing the other stuff, the traditional family value stuff. It's like too Dr. Evil. It's too like Bond villain,
Yeah. Well, they're not killing members of the group. Are they causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, Supreme?
I guess you could argue mental harm, but it seems like conservatives have this idea. Like, I think conservatives, by and large, do subscribe to the idea that like trans people are just confused and that with some therapy they'll just snap out of it or something, or that they can and should learn to just live with their body and the gender that they were assigned at birth and the body they were born into and stuff. And that I think, like, it seems like the bulk of conservatives would argue that they think that that is the best care that can be provided. Of the people, the proponents for like conversion therapy, I don't think they wish harm. Like the idea that this is like a planned harm because they'll end up committing suicide, it just seems really absurd to me. And I can't see that it's founded anywhere. Yeah.
Gotcha. We already talked about the C, I guess. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Nay, right?
Yeah, nay. I don't think there's. I think the opposite. I think they're trying to get these people to have kids and be straight and like raise families.
Okay. Now E feels more like on point, I guess. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Like, I guess sort of. Like, because you're not letting kids transition, so you're kind of forcing them to be whatever they are right now, right?
Yeah, but there's not really a forcible transition of children, right? Like they're not really sending the children to other parents.
Oh.
In fact, a big part of this is like maintaining parental control. But I understand, again, that's like a more abstract extrapolation of we are trying to forcibly preclude children from entering into this group. I think that's true. At least until a certain age, or so they argue.
Yeah, because transferring is a pretty specific word there, I suppose. Well, that's
and when we're talking about genocide, that's what we're thinking of, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You're going to go live with these people so you can learn their language and their customs, so that you don't learn the ones that you would have with your, parents, your natural parents or whatever.
Yeah. And I think that there's like, there's okay versions of this happening, and then there's genocide versions of this happening as well, which might be like gray area that isn't related to trans people. But I personally think about, like, if you bring in immigrant or refugee children and you force them to try and like learn the language or go to school in the country at like public schools or whatever to educate them on like the culture, the standards and things that are expected of them, like you're kind of transferring them from one group to another group, but forcibly. I don't know. This one's a bit.
Yeah, sure. This is kind of, I think, what I meant by the distinction that I drew between a genocide and erasure, like a trans genocide versus erasure. I feel like genocide is just not a word that can really be applicable here, because a big part of genocide is like precluding this thing from continuing in the future. Whereas I don't think there's a way to do that for like a series of potential sexual identities or gender identities that only manifest, like after adolescence or something typically. And that has like a completely random selection. It seems like it seems to be completely independent of ethnicity or whatever racial, cultural heritage or something.
Yeah. The chat is being Mimi. Yeah. Sorry, I got totally thrown off with the chat saying I'm pro genocide.
That's pretty special. I gotta be honest, man. Like, I think my greatest superpower in having these conversations is I don't read the chat.
Yeah, I just with topics like this and whatever, I'm so like, I don't care, that I feel like I need people who care to tell me what it is that they're expecting out of a conversation around this topic. Like, I just don't care so much about this because I just think it's trans erasure. We should call it trans erasure and fight at the symptoms of trans erasure. This whole genocide thing is so off-putting to me that like my brain disconnects and just goes, oh, I don't care. This is crazy. Which is why, like, I don't think we should do it, because I don't think I'm alone in that. The moment you start calling it a genocide and somebody disagrees, you're calling it this, like, incredibly awful, horrible thing that evokes images of, like, Jews in concentration camps and shit. And if their version of reality just doesn't mesh with the description of reality you're giving them, they'll just think you're unhinged and disengage. So, like, that's a whole other reason why I think you just focus on trans erasure and talk about that and not trans genocide, because you're going to turn off people and their brains are going to turn off, and you were the one that pressed the button.
Persecution. I feel like I feel like the desire to use the word genocide is to find a word that's morally loaded and alarming enough, and yeah, it's like morally indicting enough. And I think persecution meets that perfectly well. I think it's perfectly fair and reasonable to say that like LGBT people and trans people specifically are being persecuted. They're suffering a persecution. Absolutely. Legally, it's true. You know what I mean? Like politically, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But a genocide, I'm just, if you try to take me as extreme as you will go, I'm going to be the first person to like try and dig my heels in and be like, no, this is why not. This is why it's not that extreme. Because we've seen a lot of bad things come out of, I feel like more people need to learn Chinese history and like read about the Cultural Revolution and shit and the Great Leap Forward, and see how bad things can get when you just like fire people up with the most extreme rhetoric and with hyperbole and shit.
Yeah, I guess that loops us back around to the question earlier about using hyperbolic language to kind of get people to engage in a narrative. Like, it comes with its costs, and I think this would be one of them. Like we said before, if there's a single trans person that goes and tries to kill lawmakers or kill Republicans, and they say that it was in part because of what they saw on Vosh's channel, then that kind of stochastic terrorism, I guess, comes to fruition. Also, to respond to this Isabel person who says, I mean, you both seem to be talking about current policy and not long-term political goals, so you're already not really engaging with the talking point, right? We talked about that earlier already.
Wait, am I not, though? I feel like when I talk about like conservatives being worried about the erosion of traditional values, I feel like that's long-term.
Yeah. I just think that, like, if you start saying things that are against the present narrative, or you're talking past the point that they're already talking about, then they get turned off and they disengage, which is our entire argument for why you shouldn't be using genocide in the first place. This is a good example of that. Because we're kind of fighting on these points, which are beyond what they believe in, they're already not really listening to what you're saying. And that's the same thing that happens when you call it a genocide and we don't believe in that. And then our brains are going to turn off and they're not going to interpret things the right way. So I don't know. This feels like that exact principle in motion right now, is they're not hearing you out because you're talking about something past what they believe in.
Okay. This is kind of dark. Okay. But I'm going to go here because you brought me on here to discuss like my feelings on this stuff, and these are my feelings on this stuff. I told you earlier about Everything Everywhere All at Once and how that movie touched on some themes that I'm struggling with, and I look at Twitter and I see people engaging and praising and liking primarily sentiments that are just barely dishonest and just barely not true, or not really engaging with the reality of the topic or something like that. I think one of the reasons people do that has less to do with because they're actually concerned, and more to do with because it's now being framed in a way that's more interesting to them. And to that extent, I think the reason people might want to sign off on the idea that there's a trans genocide happening is because it's just more interesting. And that's really that's a really negative thing to me. If you want to the dysfunction that comes out of this is that I think some of those people are going to hear this and be like, this guy just wants to deny that there's persecution happening for like me and my people. And I'm not. I said earlier, I think the arguments are perfectly valid that trans people are persecuted today, legally, socially, culturally. But I just fear that some people are wanting to drag the goalposts a little bit further than they deserve to be, just because it's more interesting for them. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it happens to be people on Twitter that do this as well. People with smartphones, people in middle America, or that are from the American middle class, where things are by and large pretty damn good, that are kind of like screwing things up for everybody. Because, like we all grew up with the boy who cried wolf. And I see that a lot, where we saw that a lot with the whole Uyghur genocide thing, where the people who were skeptical were like, okay, you're calling this a genocide. That evokes a very strong set of images for me. And if it doesn't turn out to be true, I'm never going to believe anything you say again. And I think it's similar here. I think there's concern we need to have for like the future of trans people in this country. And if you're trying to convince me that there's a genocide happening and I don't see it, and you're like having to reframe the definition of the term or like make all these extrapolations, then I'm just going to think that things really aren't that bad for trans people, and I'm going to care about it less. And I think that's going to be the effect that is had for the overwhelming majority of people.
Yeah. Which is the opposite of what I think the people saying this stuff would want. So it's like, to make a more productive response out of what I don't think is like a super productive question. So this person asks, when would you have called the Holocaust a genocide? It started with persecution. Like, yeah, it did. And I feel like we've already gone through all the stages. We talked about persecution.
Yeah, we went through a list, and like every single part of that list was fulfilled, leading up to the Holocaust.
Yeah, when would you have, I guess, like, to pull the best out of it, let's just focus on the question, ignoring that second part that kind of tipped their hat as to what they really are asking here. When would you have called the Holocaust a genocide? I feel like this needs historical information. I don't even know if you have.
Well, I mean, I think there's basic information about the Holocaust that everybody knows. And when we went through those 10 stages, all 10 of them were fulfilled, and everybody's like aware of that. And they were fulfilled before they started having concentration camps, but those became fulfilled too, right? We went through and just did this for trans people. And I think one of them was fulfilled, and then maybe another tentative 2 where we had to like extrapolate like crazy. So more than one, I think. When more than one of those steps. I don't know where the line is beyond one, but it's definitely when more than one. And when it's the one that applies to a billion other things, like hate groups broadcast polarizing propaganda. If that qualifying means there's a genocide, well, then there's a genocide against motherfucking like pineapple on pizza lovers or something. I don't know.
Yeah, and like I feel like Occam's razor puts this really well. Just because one event precedes another event, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can call the previous event the same as the next one. You can't just say that persecution happened before the genocide, so persecution equals genocide. Like, and even with these steps, like you could check off 5 of these steps solidly. It still doesn't mean that reasonably it's going to result in a genocide.
Everyone likes
Also,
their own brand, don't they? This is
thank
magic.
you for the raid,
All
Rose
right,
Wrist.
analysis.
We're talking about your favorite topic, of course, genocide. I know you're a big lover of genocide, so you'll be happy and excited to hear that we're beating this horse to death even further. And referring to it as a horse, I guess, is a step forward. Dehumanization.
Here's the olive branch, okay? Can I foresee this trend continuing with conservative policy to the point where we reach genocide? It's not likely, but I can see that more. I think mainstream conservatives want to fulfill more and more of this list over time. I can foresee that happening, but not where it's like starts to be implemented the country over, or where it actually reaches that stage. But listen, I'll be the first to say, like, when, the further we go along this path, I'm going to move my rhetoric the more that the trends continue, right?
Yes.
Like, I'm going to go from saying they're just persecuted to saying, okay, like we are getting dangerously close to, like, approaching a genocide or something like that. But you asked me where we are right now, and I've told you where I think we are right now. The concern is warranted, but trying to get me to agree that a genocide is occurring is not happening with the current state of affairs.
Yeah, like if we fully realize stage 2, that alone would be enough for me to really start, like, I don't know, raising an alarm depending on how it's implemented. Like, if you start identifying all of the people who are trans in the country and build some kind of like trans database, and then we're forming laws around those trans, like, oh, okay, hold on, this is getting really, really weird. I think we're getting to a point where this is getting dangerous. And Vel's also mentioned, let's remember that one of the steps on that list was extermination. That one would probably be enough alone. It's not as if all the items on the list are equal, which is true as well.
True.
So it's nuanced, and we have to look at the reality of what's happening and then base it on the reality of what's happening. I don't think any amount of like this list, I don't think that the existence of this list would have helped me necessarily identify it going on right now. If anything, I kind of feel like it obfuscates looking at the reality of what's going on, because I have certain unspoken or even unknown lines that political institutions in the country would cross, at which point I would be worried about trans people in a way that is beyond just like they're being legislated against or having medical rights taken away, and would go into the realm of like genocide, or like we're rounding them up and this isn't cool or something like that, right? Like,
and I'm not even sure their medical rights are, well, certain, I suppose, in like a roundabout way. Like the idea is that like certain kids can't have certain procedures done without the parents' knowledge or something like that. And even then, in the Florida bill, I think they said, like, unless you can make the case that there's like abuse happening at home or something like that. So yeah, I don't know. I think this is a case where there's like a zero-sum sort of rights lending versus rights taking away when it comes to children, where it's like there's a right being granted to children that naturally comes at the cost of children. I'm sorry, there's a right being granted to parents that naturally comes at a cost to children or something like that, but that there's a caveat even there to make room for the things that we want there to be room for or something. I think that bill is abhorrent for a couple of reasons that I've highlighted in my own content, but just to give you an example of like even some of the most egregious legislation that's been in recent news still doesn't amount to like genocide or something like that.
yeah. Genocide's a very specific thing, whereas erasure is probably very good at being descriptive of what's happening now. Maybe we should probably just be using erasure. But yeah. What are you gonna do?
Yeah.
Because like you said, it is more, genocide is more fun. It's more fun. People like genocide.
Genocide is sexy, right? It's a big sexy word.
Oh yeah.
Like apocalypse.
Let me a tall glass of genocide.
Like people talked about the coronavirus like it was the apocalypse. The world ended. Are you kidding? We all fucking, come on, man.
Well, not all of us, but
fair enough. Sure, some people died, but
yeah. The flu kills people. I don't know. Yes,
we don't wanna get
coronavirus
started.
is bad. Coronavirus is bad. To be clear, coronavirus is bad. It's not bad for everybody.
Yeah, but society hasn't crumbled.
No, that wasn't the end of like travel as we know it, or this or that, or the other things we were concerned
Hell,
about.
the number 2 superpower tried to be like, hey, apocalypse time, maybe take over a country, and they fucked up. So yeah, I don't know.
Jesus Christ. So you said that you had listened to the January 6th hearing. Did you want to talk about that at all?
I don't have a whole lot to say about it. I feel like some of the stuff, I wish we had gotten more concrete evidence, like some of the testimony about how Trump said that like Pence deserves to be hanged or something like that. I wish we had gotten something more concrete. Testimony does not weigh too heavily with me personally. I basically don't really favor testimony at all when it comes to like something of this nature. Like, oh, really? It's literally he said, she said. Like, it's actually, hearsay as far as I'm concerned. But it's interesting, and it wouldn't surprise me if it ended up being true, him saying things like that. And I think the idea that Trump wanted those protesters to go and stop the election from being officiated is true. I think that's been basically, it's not even a leap. Like, I don't think you have to do much. Just his response to that is enough to convince me that he wanted that to occur, that was what he intended to occur. And all those people saying Trump told me to come here, all the rhetoric about trial by combat, I hope Pence does the right thing, referring to stopping the election or something like that. When that first happened, I remember thinking, if we don't draw the line here, where the fuck do we draw the line? My response to January 6th was our democracy has been threatened in a way that it has not since we had war on our own soil. It's amazing to me, if Trump gets away with this, he's really raised the bar for what you can get away with in terms of threatening the sanctity of our democracy. I remember that being my response at the time, but I also recognized that, political power is power for power's sake. And Trump having a constituency behind him that was approving of him to the extent that they would either participate in a forcible stop of the officiation or apologize for it. In a democracy, again, it's one of the sort of paradoxes of democracy. If you've got like a large enough portion of the country that's willing to do something undemocratic, then suddenly it just becomes democratic until it's not anymore. I kind of realized at the time the reason they can't really pursue this right now is because there is a large contingency of people in this country of people who approve of Donald Trump, want him to be president, are pissed off about the results of the election. We can't do this right now. If they're going to do an investigation, if they're going to do like like a whole dog and pony show about, whether or not Trump was culpable in it, it can't happen right now. We have to wait some time. It's 2022 now. We're finally getting to this a couple of years later. It looks like, I'm pretty convinced anyway. It looks like we're finally getting to the stage where we're able to say, okay, Donald Trump probably caused this to happen, and it was really bad. Cooler heads will have prevailed. You know what I mean? If we've given people a couple years to calm down over this, the number of people who are upset about the election have dwindled, or at least upset enough to this day contend that it was stolen or that it's fraudulent or something like that. Yeah, I think I'm glad we're getting around to it.
And did it happen in 2021 or 2022 or 2020? I mean,
well, it first occurred in 2021, but okay. I'm saying that the hearing about whether or not Trump was culpable is happening, later now.
One thing I will point out, and I'm glad you brought this up with her quote, I was so fucking confused by it. So she says, and I quote from the Washington Post, and I've seen the same quote in other places, aware of the rioters' chats to, quote, hang Mike Pence, end quote, the president responded with this sentiment, quote, maybe our supporters have the right idea, end quote. Mike Pence, quote, deserves it, end quote. Like, hold on. So she says, responded with this sentiment. Is the sentiment meaning that we don't have word for word what he had said here? And why do we have a space in between about deserving it? Like, I just, the whole way everything is quoted and worded
it's
and
so
whatever.
Broken up.
Yeah. I just, and I'm not like doing defense for Trump. Like, I don't, like I don't even think it's unlikely necessarily that he had said this, but the presentation is what I have a problem with here from Cheney. And I just like, it was like that for quite a few things in the pieces that I watched at the hearing from people, where I had more or less the same problems that you had. Like, I want more specificity, I want more quotes. Like, I don't feel like we're getting a ton of that from people, but I don't know.
Yeah, like, here's what I'll say. There have been a lot of comparisons between Trump and like a fascist, a traditional fascist or fascism. And I was, it was a similar situation where when you go down the list the same way we did with transgenocide, where I was like, okay, kind of here, kind of there, definitely here, definitely there, definitely not here, definitely not there. Throughout his presidency, more of those boxes got checked. And I think, personally, the idea that Donald Trump is a fascist and like, the party of Trump was a party of fascism, I got bingo with January 6th. I think January 6th was a bingo. It was like a straight flush down the bingo card. Yeah, and it's not even worth anymore wondering, was it like intentional from the start, or did he just stumble into it? I'm happy with the comparison. Now, I'm not going to go out on the street corner and say Donald Trump is a fascist, because everybody, overuses that word and nobody agrees with its meaning anyway. My understanding and usage of the word is, totally to draw parallels with Benito Mussolini's, fascist party, and the intentions in this, the sort of the 14 points, right? Like, I think they apply to Trump in totality, with all of his actions throughout his presidency and culminating in January 6th, trying to forcibly overturn the democratic results of an election using his political power. Yeah.
Well, as big a fan as I am of genocide, I'm not the biggest fan of fascism. So, like, I'm always careful with calling people fascist or whatever. I think for sure he's authoritarian, but that's just probably because of my lack of education on the term itself. But this anti-democratic, like, just everything, the whole way he handled it, the way he talked about it afterwards, the way he talked about it at the beginning and while it was happening and okaying it, the statements of the Proud Boys that had happened before this, like, it's all just so bad. I was shocked that like people in the Republican Party were still like in huge support of him and still supporting the big lie after this, because I felt like, okay, I could kind of understand how it could be politically advantageous for you to act like the election was fraudulent and whatever. But the moment that a bunch of the supporters stormed the Capitol, if I were a politician, I would start backpedaling real fucking quick from all of that. And I didn't
they
see
did
it.
as quick as they could. They couldn't backpedal too quickly, because then they would just make themselves enemies of the party of Trump, which the GOP by and large was, right, by the end of those 4 years. Yeah, but you did start to see people backing away from Trump at that point. And I think over time, history is going to remember Trump as an absolute traitor and, easily the worst president we've ever had. And in no small part contributed by that fact. But my calculation that he's, a fascist has more to do with, there is that. And again, that really crossed the T for me, but it's everything, right? It's like this idea that America was once a great country and it's in a fallen state now because of all these cultural practices and pluralism and allowing in all these different ethnicities and stuff. And that we have to rebuild a strong national character and rebuild, our identity as a strong nation and sort of like reclaim our destiny as like the strongest nation in the world. And that's going to come through, some foreign intervention. We didn't see a whole lot of that through Trump, but we, a little bit with the fire and fury, the posturing and stuff. That's kind of loose. That's a little bit weak. But certainly, I think Bill O'Reilly was probably the first person to lay the groundwork for, reinforcing the identity of the Christian family unit and Christian values. And I think Trump sort of picked those up. And that's a thing that sort of incidentally sort of falls into that fascist calculation that there is one particular type of way to be the best American. And anybody that's not participating in being an American in this way, which is like upholding Christian values, is definitionally sort of dividing the nation or deteriorating the state of the nation or the quality of the nation or something like that. They're not living up to American values. They're not being a real American. And they're the reason that we've entered this fallen state. I think that Trump sort of fell into all that stuff The way that he tried to project strength and told people to be strong and that there needed to be a strong leader, the way that he alienated everybody that was ever close to him. And he made it very clear that you're either with me or against me. I don't make allies. I am the strong man that can bring our country back to glory, and I alone, and nobody else is going to usurp my throne. And anybody that crosses me in even the smallest way is going to be, completely fucking excised from me and my, my staff or whatever it is. It's all these things combined, right?
Yeah. And like to add something from the chat that I thought was good, it maybe has some of why I'm hesitant. It's complicated. I quote, "It's complicated because Trump seems to assume fascism opportunistically, while the hardcore Christian right, or maybe just his supporters more generally, that supports him is much more classically fascist, with a clear focus on their national myth and such." I think he does focus on national myth. I don't think he's nearly as like anti-immigrant for the sake of being immigrant as I see in Europe, which has given me kind of a new
He tried. All the courts slapped him down. It was one of his first EOs within his first like fucking 90 days of presidency, right? He had the whole Muslim travel ban.
Yeah, but that's less. I mean that his messaging and whatever is way less overt than I see in some of these European countries. So
when Mexico sends their best, or when Mexico sends their people, they're not sending their best. They're sending murderers, rapists, thieves.
But like,
some of them I assume are good people. Come on, man.
Like what? Like, hold on. Maybe I should explain this more. So him having these one-liners and stuff like that is very, very different from explicitly making his entire platform around how immigrants are awful people and immigration is the key to all of our problems. Like, I don't think that he's nearly as clear about
Build the wall.
that. Yeah, but again,
I don't know.
But being against illegal immigration, being against gangs coming over the border, these individual things I don't feel like are comparable to somebody who makes their entire platform overtly about how like these groups of people are necessarily bad.
You're right. There is a degree of separation. But again, it's one of those things where in totality, it was build the wall. It was all these bad people are coming from Mexico and they're stealing your jobs and they're the reason you're poor. You, the Volk, the common man, your problems, the root of them, a big part of it is immigration. And you know what? We'll just say illegal immigration because that's easier for me to fearmonger politically. But the Muslim ban didn't fall into any of that illegal immigration or anything like that. He was just like, yeah, terrorists bad. We hate terrorists. You know who the terrorists are? It's the Muslims. So yeah, I don't know. Again, in totality, you combine all these things and it has the effect.
In totality, yes. And effect is a key word because some people in chat are pointing this out. Where his supporters take things is different than what Trump is always saying. That supporters and stuff are going further than what he's actually saying. And so if you look at the effect of the totality of the things that he's saying and you measure it based on that, it's a lot more clear. But I don't think it's nearly as clear looking at him and comparing it to other people that are very, very clearly anti-immigration, period, where I don't...
I think you're right.
Yeah. But again, I'm not pro-Trump. I'm not pro-anti-immigration or any... Because, like, dude, I wonder if you have a solution for this problem, because it's been a fun thing to ask different streamers about. How do you deal with the problem where when you're explaining why people understand something or you have problems with like going headlong against a particular position, people then interpret it as like you're supporting the position or you believe in the position?
I think it was actually Destiny that said he said it to me at one point, and only me. I was in his wall, as you see.
I get sick and tired of every single time I fucking say anything. I've got to make 72 different qualifications, or else you guys are gonna fucking have your nuts drop off.
Where he was like, people only believe in like one of three positions, like 0%, 50%, or 100%. And I think I wanted to be skeptical of that. I don't want that to be true, but the more I pay attention, the more I think that is the case. That people like they think you're either making a case for why to be on the fence or why all the way towards this thing or all the way away from that thing. Like, is this guy agreeing with me? He's not on my team. He's got to be on the other team. Is this guy saying a nice thing about the opposition? He must be on their team, right? He's not 100% against this guy. That means he must be for it.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good way of explaining it. You either think they're entirely against it or entirely for it. But the misinterpretations are like a whole other meme. Like I have one on screen right now. This dude tweeted, Twitter, the only space where well-articulated sentences still get misinterpreted. You can say, I like pancakes, and somebody will say, so you hate waffles? No, bitch. That's a whole new sentence. What the fuck is you talking about?
Yes.
And we get long form content too. It doesn't matter if it's Twitter. On Twitch, we literally get to interact with them. They could ask questions and they still do this. It's live interaction in long form. I think that you could have a longer Twitch message than you could have a tweet, right? Like, it's just, it's insane to me. Ugh.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, I don't know. This is again, everything everywhere all at once. It's my bagel moment. It's my fucking. Have you seen the movie?
Yes.
Okay, can we talk about the movie?
Yes, let's transition into that. So